In industrial organizational psychology, we're going to talk about psychologists who work in the field and in companies, and why this field is a very popular area for people who work in the field of psychology to work in. First off, you've learned that psychology is a science. It's the science of human behavior, emotions, cognition, and motivation. When we think of industrial organizational psychology, we think of the human behavior, cognitions, emotion, motivation as it relates to the work environment. So in industrial organizational psychology, there's a dual focus. There's a focus on the organization. How is this organization working as a whole? And also the employee. What is the health and well-being of the people who are working for the company? It also has a dual nature when it comes to practice as scientist and practitioner. So there's the application of psychological principles in the workplace, and then there's also the development and discovery of principles for the actual job. So industrial organizational psychology is the branch that applies to the principles of psychology. It's like applied psychology in the field. The purpose of industrial organizational psychology is to enhance the dignity and performance of human beings and the organizations they work in by advancing the science of knowledge of human behavior. So we want to look at what's working well for a company and what's not working well. Why is Google considered one of the best places in the world to work? Why are employees so happy? What are they doing that's making it work for them? Chances are there's been an industrial organizational psychologist who's gone in and told them how to make it work. This is important because when you are an adult, you spend the majority of your time at work. If you're not at work, you're probably sleeping. You probably have to take time off to engage in any other major activities. About 153 million Americans are a part of the labor force. This is according to stats in 2007. And in the field of industrial psychology, this is necessary because we know that there are people who are satisfied with their job. We know that there are people who are dissatisfied with their job. And I can guarantee when somebody hires you for a job, they aren't hiring you because they want you to do it for 1 or 2 years. They want you to have longevity in the job. So companies are invested in trying to make it work. If the organization is effective, the company is all about making money, and psychologists can help organizations reduce their costs and improve performance and productivity so companies can make the money they want to make. To become an industrial organizational psychologist, you just need an advanced degree, so either a master's or a doctorate degree. And then you also need to complete work in basic psychology, research methods, industrial organizational content, your thesis, dissertation, the qualifying exam, internship. Those are things that are related to just being in graduate school. Approximately 4% of psychologists work in the field of industrial organizational psychology. So that's a very small number of people who do the job. SIOP is the Society for Individual and Organizational Psychologists, which is the governing institution that plays the role of the APA over the field. So it's the organization that makes sure that people who work in the field are doing what they're supposed to. But you actually don't even need to get a license. You just need to have the advanced degree, the master's and the doctorate in the field. Many people oftentimes think of being an industrial psychologist like being in a business program, and here are some of the differences. IO psychologists rely on the application of psychological principles to get things done, and they also focus on the factors in a business that impact people. It's based on research, quantitative methods, and testing techniques. So they don't have anything to do with actually getting the job done. They just look at how is the job working? How is it going? What are people saying about it? And here are some differences between people who might get a job in industrial organizational psychology and then, of course, being in an MBA program. So we can see that clearly there are differences in what that would look like. Here are some of the activities that people who work in industrial organizational psychology, they're more like personnel people. They're going to analyze the job. They will help with recruiting and selecting employees and training them, assessing people's performance, trying to promote and retain people, looking at testing and validation and legal issues. So the industrial part of it is looking more at the people who are in the job. The organizational part is how do people feel about their work? Why are they doing what they're doing? How is this work designed? Are we doing the right tools? So the organizational part is actually being in the field and looking at how it's working within the organization. Most industrial organizational psychologists work in universities, consulting firms, industry corporations, and government agencies. Things have become, a lot more diverse as, time has gone on. So you can pretty much find a job anywhere because businesses want to increase worker productivity and performance. So industrial organizational psychologists are very needed. So here's a chart that kind of shows us the universities, consulting firm, government, how many people work in private or in other areas. Most work in universities, so they're probably teaching. People who get MAs primarily work in consulting or private practice. And then people who get PhDs are many of the people who are in education, are consulting and private work. You can make a good salary, pretty good salary, working as an industrial organizational psychologist as well. So how did this field of industrial psychology come about? It came about in the early 1900s when applying psychology and industrial engineering was looked at to improve efficiency. So Walter Dill Scott looked at the psychology of advertising and increasing human efficiency. He helped contribute to the World War I application of industrial psychology in the Army. The United States Army was one of the main branches that used industrial organizational psychologists to help them in times of war, to figure out what are we doing well, what do we need to do better, how can we make people satisfied with this job. Frederick Taylor was an engineer who focused on redesigning work. He looked at the science over rule of thumb, scientific selection, cooperation, and why that was important in a job, rather working together in a group rather than working by yourself. And that's a principle that still exists today. And also having an equal division of work, which is best suited to management and to employees. So you don't want to have one person doing more of a job than another person and they're getting paid the same salary. Frederick Taylor was one of the main people who allowed industrial organizations to, he advised and they complied to force people to have breaks. If they're handling heavy iron and doing things like that, people will be 3 times more productive and it's going to cost half of what it was costing if somebody gets hurt or if something happens to the equipment if you just give them a break. So that might be a crane operator or somebody like that who, is working all of these long hours and not taking a break. And he said, hey, give these people a break and they'll be more productive at their job. Lillian and Frank Gilbreth worked together As husband and wife, Lillian focused on stress and fatigue on workers. She looked at what was making people dissatisfied with their job. And Frank focused on the technical aspects of worker efficiency. Like, how are people able to accomplish the things they need to accomplish on their job? Lillian gave a speech in 1908 to focus. Lillian gave a speech in 1908 to focus on the need for attention to the person element. And they both later invented the foot pedal trash can. Hugo Monsterberg is considered the father of industrial psychology. He developed a trolley car simulator and studied various aspects of being at a job. He went into companies and he observed how things were working. He looked at what makes a person a good operator. He analyzed their behavior, and he basically pioneered the idea of job analysis, and that's why he's called the father of industrial psychology. During World War I, the Army had what was called the Alpha Project. And that is where they hired psychologists, and they started screening for intelligence and looked at, what things they could do to make people be qualified to be in the military. The Journal of Applied Psychology was sort of developed during that time period. It was the first journal in industrial organizational psychology, and it's still the most prestigious journal in that field. It documented all of the Army Alpha and Beta projects that they were doing with soldiers. Between the wars, James Cattell worked in psychological cooperation to provide services to various industries, and the Hawthorne studies took place. The Hawthorne studies were very important because there were research studies conducted at Harvard and MIT by Elton Mayo. And what he did was he went into a chemical plant. It was called the Hawthorne Electrical Company. And he looked at what would be some cost-effective ways for that company to reduce some of their expenses. And he thought, okay, one thing we can do is we can adjust the amount of lighting. He also found that the impact of intervention and doing something different on employee performance was the result of the intervention itself. There's a nice term in psychology called the Hawthorne effect. So what happened was when Mayo went into this organization, all of the people who were there working saw him walk in. What happens as soon as you're on a job and somebody new walks in, even if you don't know who they are? You probably naturally perform your job a little better. And that's what the Hawthorne effect tells us, that if somebody observes you working, you're going to perform better because you know somebody's watching you. In World War II, the Army also hired industrial organizational psychologists to select, recruit, and then to classify them for their various careers. They created the general classification test to group people together and to sort them based on their abilities. After World War II, things became more specialized, and these are some various things that happened in the field of industrial organization. They started to evolve into working in practices in schools, in the government. They played a role in the Civil Rights Act and Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, various court cases. During the information age, there was a higher demand for organizations and employees. So we had to start looking at things like applying cognitive psychology to industrial organizational psychology and how globalization is impacting development in the United States. So that's everything you need to know in the field of industrial organizational psychology.